Should we kick it off, Jacob?
Let's do it. Let's get into this. I'm ready. I also love that we already have some questions coming in the Q&A section that's there. By all means, jump those questions into there as we kind of go through this. We'll pre-load some questions in there. Thank you, Ricky. And Chad, I'm going to hand you to you, though, for intros.
All right. Thanks, Jacob. Well, good morning here from the West Coast in the US. And my name is Chad. I'm a designer advocate here at Figma. And I'm joined today by the one and only Jacob Miller.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jacob. I'm a product manager over here on design systems. So definitely eager to answer all of your design systems questions. And in addition to us, we are also joined by two others today.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Anna, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Anna. I'm also a designer advocate from Figma, and I'm based in San Francisco.
Awesome. And my name's Anthony. I'm also a designer advocate here in San Francisco. It's so nice to see so many folks joining us today. Always love getting to be a guest on these live streams. So thank you for having us.
All right. So as we're kicking off today, just a little housekeeping. This session today, it is being recorded and it will be available on the Figma YouTube channel in the next week or so, which you'll be able to check out at youtube.com/Figma Design. Today, it's going to really be all about Q&A. So be sure to use that Q&A button. If you see a question in there that you really like, you can also upvote that question to bring that up in the list. Also, use the chat, connect with the rest of the community. And as a part of that, we do have our Figma Code of Conduct in effect, as we do with all live streams and events. So you can learn more about that at figma.com/code-of-conduct. In short, though, be kind, be respectful of one another. We're all here to learn and have fun. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to recap real quick. Jacob, this is our last building blocks of 2022. It's amazing. So we're going to recap a little bit of what we've covered. And then as a part of that, just as a segue to our AMA today, we're going to talk a little bit about something we haven't really talked about yet with design system teams. And that's just the benefit of hosting open office hours where folks can walk in and ask questions. And speaking of questions, of course, today we are going to spend the majority of our time answering all of your questions about design systems, design system features, best practices, whatever you want to throw at us today. All right, Jacob, do you want to talk a little bit about some of our origins of building blocks and where we've started?
Absolutely. I mean, we got started, God, it was almost a year ago now, which is kind of crazy thinking about that. We've gone through a ton of these episodes that are here covering all aspects from the very start of your actual design system journey all the way to the very end. And when we first started jumping into this, one of the things that we really did was just go through the existing system that we had and identify all the elements that were reusable elements inside of our design system and whether or not they should be part of our design system. So it was really just that starting moment for design systems. If that's where you are within your company, within your side project or whatever, by all means, take a look at that kind of YouTube video that's there, and you can kind of get a sense of how you actually get started at the very foundational level for design systems. And in episode 2,
yeah, episode 2, we took it into how do we get started in crafting our components. We've already done a bit of an audit and found reusable pieces through our site. So we talked a little bit about, how a sticker sheet can help you visualize everything in one place and start to plan out, where are there inconsistencies, where are there consistencies, and how to identify what you are going to build into a reusable component. And then also in our third episode, we took that a step further. And once we've identified everything that we were going to build in, it became all about how do we polish that and publish our very first version of our libraries, maybe some introductory documentation, as well as some beginning communication pieces for how do you communicate what assets are available to your teams. And then Jacob, I know the next one was a
favorite of yours.
Absolutely. Diving into documentation there was one of the ones that we really covered. And for me, documentation is always something that we're really passionate about here, because a design system is much more than just its components that are there. What you really need to do is make sure that people know how to use those components, that you know that there's best practices for it. If you look at the origins of design systems, I mean, these evolved from brand guidelines way back in the day. And along the way, somehow we kind of lost that message that's there oftentimes with these systems, and we don't have that actual usage guidelines that are present. And so we really push for you to actually include this documentation here, but not only documentation for the individual components, but the documentation for processes inside of your design system for things like how to contribute back into it. That is what leads to a really robust design system that doesn't branch off and split into other different subsystems that are out there. And next up we have,
you teed up those ABCs, or as we did it, the CBAs, so perfectly there. Really identifying what should live in your system versus what should teams own at their level. Really about how to create a contribution model. And when you are accepting contributions, whether that is component updates, whether it is documentation updates, or maybe it's something brand new to consider including in the system. Some best practices and ways to approach accepting those contributions, and also to test them, and the importance of how you evolve components and test them, which, Jacob, you had a really, really cool example that you shared in.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we were talking about is advancing your component library that's there. And the thing that Chad was alluding to was a technique that I like to use for these visual regression tests that are there is actually to take the original component that you have, create an instance of it, create a copy of that instance directly on top of it, and set its blending mode to difference, and then detach that actual instance itself. And effectively what you have is you have a preserved state of that instance on top of an actual live instance of it. And so that way, if you ever see any changes inside of that live instance that's there, you'll know it's broken from the previous state that's there. And so you can do some easy kind of regression testing. And those are some of the tips and tricks we really covered when we were talking about advancing your component library, really bringing it to the next level to add that polish and fit and finish on it.
Awesome. And that brings us to today, which is our 7th episode. And something we didn't really talk about through all of this is, we talked about communication being an underlying piece as a part of all of these episodes, really making sure that if you are on a design system team or you're a maintainer, having that communication with the consumers of your design system, and, being able to provide places for them to give you feedback as well. And, one thing that we've seen teams in the community do, something that I've also done in my past role, is setting up design system office hours, or ask me anything. And the importance of having these, it really provides that walk-in opportunity for design system consumers to come in. They can ask questions about, why was something built this way, or am I using this correctly, or hey, what do you think about this? It's also a very easy place to allow folks to make suggestions and just generally engage with the design system team to learn more about it. At the same time, while it's learning for the consumers, it can also be a great learning moment for the design system team themselves. Sometimes you'll get that preview into how teams are using your assets, and you can start to understand how the system is being perceived amongst the consumers. How are they using it? Maybe they're telling you, we're detaching the heck out of this component because it doesn't meet our use cases. And you can really have some great dialogue. Also, as a design system team, it's cool to see everything that's happening across your organization and how those assets are being used. Another cool thing that you can also do is maybe you have some work in progress and you are working on some of those evolutionary pieces to your assets. Show your work in progress, get feedback from teams. Is this beneficial? Will this help your team achieve X better? Are you able to work more efficiently if we were able to make this change? One thing I've found is that teams really love seeing, work in progress and what's going to be coming. At the same time, sometimes you might even see that office hours, maybe folks don't respond to that. Try different naming as well. So maybe make it a design system work with us hour, or make it an open forum, just ways to get folks to come in and ask their questions. All right. So with that, Jacob, do you want to talk a little about AMA? Ask us everything. I know
that questions are
always fun.
Absolutely. I mean, as Chad said, that importance of office hours is really paramount whenever you're having this kind of robust design system that's there. And one of the things that we've learned doing these building block sessions, over the last, few months that's here, is people really have a ton of questions whenever there's anything design systems related. And that's why for this very last one that we're doing, we really wanted to just be an open forum for you to ask all of us questions. Bring those questions that we have. We see there's already 21 going on right now inside of the Q&A that's there, which is awesome to see. Hopefully that we will actually get through all of them this time, as in previous sessions we have finished, I don't think we've ever finished the Q&A section. So we've got a full hour, or at least 45 minutes left right now. Shall we jump into it?
Let's do it.
I think maybe a good place to kick off is this one is the most upvoted question. So again, for people who are joining in, either ask questions or feel free to thumbs up questions that you want to prioritize. We'll definitely be taking that into consideration. But yeah, the first one is, how do you suggest managing theming in Figma? Dark mode versus light mode, internal versus external use cases?
I'm happy to field that unless you want to jump in, Anna.
Sure. No, I'd love to hear your perspective.
Dark mode and light mode, I mean, it's obviously one of the things that is critical for any design system that's there, is to support modes that are present inside of that system. And that is something that we are currently building out a tokens feature for. We promise we are working on it, and that's something you really want to have native semantic token support for in order to really push that advancement of theming. We did do during the last config how we approach and what I'd recommend doing is using that semantic naming structure with your styles today.
Jacob, I think we've lost your audio there.
What's that?
I think we've lost your audio there.
Oh, we lost my audio. Amazing.
So many great things. It adds to that mystique of working on tokens, right?
It's perfect timing.
Perfect timing of all those new features.
Can you hear me now? Check.
All right. Well, I think, really one of the main things Jacob was saying there is, even going back to config and talking about how Figma has approached tokens here in our own light and dark mode, something that I'll also say, this is a question that as a designer advocate, I get asked this question a lot, and I'm sure you do, Anthony. I know you do as well. I think ways of approaching that, yes, semantic tokens, that will definitely help with that. Obviously, we know that folks are working on systems now, and some things we've seen from the community, sometimes using swap library if you have very small mode changes where maybe you're just doing like a light mode, a dark mode. We've also seen teams do this where they might have multi-brand systems and they need to control beyond just a simple light and dark mode. Oftentimes we see plugins used for that approach. Themer is a real common one that I've seen teams use. Also, a lot of teams will build custom internal plugins for directly integrating with their code base and handling theming that way. We've seen the Figma tokens plugin be used for lightweight theming as well. We've seen approaches where people are using variants We don't necessarily recommend that, but there are certain cases where you might want to explore it. It's my favorite 2 words as a designer, right? It depends.
I'll step in here too, as well, is that I really like the distinction between themes and modes.
Did we lose Anthony this time?
Right. So if we think about
I like
modes
the
as being
distinction as well.
Thank you all so much. We're having some issues in the office today, but thank you all for working through this. So yeah, so like those distinctions between theme and mode are key, right? Because
All right. Well, maybe this is a sign that we shouldn't talk much more about the themes
and modes or
cool. So why don't we move on to our next question here, and we can jump.
you may have
and
multiple brands. Oh man.
Anthony, we lost you for a solid. Oh, he's gone this time. Let's jump into the next question that's here. Thank you again, Stephanie, for asking this, which is, what are the best practices to name design tokens? I personally am a big fan of doing semantic naming that's here. And to really explain what I mean by semantic naming, we often talk about things like, atomic names or semantic names when we're referring to tokens. And there's a bunch of different names for these, but they really boil down to the same thing, which is on atomic, which is what I usually kind of use to refer to this. You have namings for things which describe the color itself. So you have something like red 300, for instance, or red 200, red 100. And then with semantic naming, what you have is things that are actually naming and describing the use of that particular token that's there. So things like BG brand or text danger, that sort of thing. I highly recommend, especially when you're using any sort of design token for theming, that you orient around that semantic naming structure that's there. And I'll pass that to Anna and Chad. Anything to add?
Yeah, I definitely agree that semantic is the most common approach that I've seen from a lot of people and talking with them about how they've set up their design system. And I also am going to just drop in a quick link. This is a schema talk from last year that I always revisit. It's from Asana's team, and basically they show like their step-by-step process of how they go about naming their different styles and components using the semantic system that they've established. So it's a super great reference point. I highly recommend that you guys check out the video whenever you have time.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add on there as well is, sometimes when I see the different approach on the naming, right, you may have certain colors or styles that are used that you want to remain consistent no matter what theme you might be using. So those may make more sense to use atomic names there. If you're using something that it's an illustration where a stroke should always be brand green, right? Well, maybe you just call it brand green, or maybe you just call it green 300 if that's what your alias is for brand green. Just call it green 300. It'll always be whatever that assigned green 300 is. Semantics, it helps a lot more with changing the theme because there might not be a green 300 in another theme. So therefore, if you use that maybe brand primary for it, that illustration might be green in one theme, but then it might be purple in another, and you meant for it to stay green. So those are cases where you may want to consider still using an atomic naming style. Awesome. Next question here from Hoyt. How do you resize elements in a component instance, specifically a card where the image resizes and the card reformats to fit? Couple of approaches here, whether constraints, auto layout. Anthony, Anna, do either of you have any thoughts on this or how you would approach?
I will attempt this again if my internet can stay up, but yeah, so here's a couple of thoughts, right? So there's a difference between, I think, adaptive resizing and responsive resizing when it comes to how components can change their structures in order to fit different, whether it's screen real estate or different devices or different even distances. Is another good way to think about it, right? Like, how am I perceiving this content based on the distance of how close I am. Is it a television screen? Is it a mobile screen? Things like that. And when it comes to responsive resizing, so things that auto layout can support very well today, so things like filling the available space or having multiple child elements that can take up different area, that can be handled pretty well, I think, with how you would handle this within a single component. Now, once you start to move beyond that, once you start to move to changes where your layout is adapting to a point that you're struggling to figure this out with auto layout, I look to things like variants. And then variants are a great example to be able to create some of those additional layouts, because now we're talking about different parts of a component that we can change, right? When we have instances, there are certain properties of those instances that can't be adjusted right now, such as, if you have things that are currently set to fixed widths and things like that, you're going to have to create different variants in order to adjust them. And that's actually a great approach for this. Does it feel a little redundant? It can sometimes. This is true, but sometimes that clarity, that a good expression I always love is that clever is not always better, right? Like you could spend a lot of time and a lot of energy to try to make this one single little component that does all of these different things. When in reality, maybe just having 2 or 3 different variants can be a great way to do it. You could even make the point that at some point, maybe a whole separate component might be necessary, because the use case and the placement and where you're using that different sizes and different widths might be really, really relevant. And I will slow down. Sorry if I was a little fast there.
So sort of in summary, it depends. Once again, it really depends on how you intend your designers to use the component. If you do want it to be responding based on the content that they're putting in, if you want to give them the freedom to, change this component into whatever width, or if you want to have some very specific, like these are 3 different sizes that we have, you can choose between whichever one, and then maybe vertically it's going to change in height depending on the content, but otherwise the width is fixed. It's just depending on what is like the key use case, what kind of guidance you want to give to your designers. There's multiple ways to approaching it.
And when you're thinking about components atomically like that, the elements within the component are probably going to be instances of other components as well. You might have shared button instances, shared iconography, shared other elements inside of larger components, right? So as you're building up your larger components, that need for them to be really atomic may not be as important. You may have a card layout with several different variations, and that's totally fine. It doesn't necessarily need to be you don't have to force yourself to say, oh, this thing really should be a single component. You can start to think with more components and start to think a little bit more about how can this set of components be expressive in the way of what I need it to accomplish, because that might be even simpler for other people to understand as well.
Awesome. So our next question here, and I know we saw a little of this on Twitter as well, and a great question from Claire here. Do you recommend a single file per component structure or a single library file? And how do we recommend scaling components across web and native mobile? This is a great question, even as it's asked there. At our Schema New York event, Jules Forrest from Credit Karma talked there, and she did a live stream with Figma last year where they actually outlined how Credit Karma approaches a file per component, and they do some cool stuff with that, which you can actually check that out on our YouTube channel. Mind blank there for a moment. Check that out on our YouTube channel where you can see Jules talk about that. But then the other approach of single library file, we do see that sometimes where you might contain all of your styles and some components in a single file. Where I've personally seen that most often is when you are starting out and you're just getting started. It might make sense just to put everything together while you have a smaller system. But then what we see as teams start to scale that is, hey, you know what? Our mobile team might not need access to our web components, or they might not need to be working with this specific set of icons. So maybe we want to branch this out and split. Maybe our styles are used the same. So maybe we're going to cut those styles and create a new library and move them and separate out our styles, whether that's your color styles, your text styles, any like shadows or elevation. putting that in its own file and publishing it, while then having web components in another file, mobile components in another file. It allows you to publish those libraries and enable them as defaults for specific teams. It's probably what I see most commonly. Jacob, I know that you also see a lot of this, especially in feedback from design system teams. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a piece of feedback that we get quite a bit. And I think it really also depends on the use case for your actual designers in your company. I mean, think of a design system like a product, and you do have to solicit that feedback from your designers that are there. One thing that I'd really recommend kind of thinking about is if you are going with this kind of one component per file architecture, I'd really only recommend doing that if you have a single design system that you're using internally. And the main reason why is if you have 60 different checkboxes that every designer has to check on and off every single time they're switching to a new library that's there, that's going to be a bad experience. And what you're going to end up having happen is they're going to create their own separate library that's there. And the consumption of it is going to fork, and you're going to get some splinter systems inside of the system. So think about that consumption experience that's there as well. If you do have like a singular design system authority in your company, and you can just publish that and have all those on by default, then I think you're totally fine to do this one component per file approach. Anthony, Anna, anything to add?
I'm a strong believer of don't create more complexity until you absolutely need it and you're aware of the trade-offs. I think that that's the piece more than anything, that if you decide to go down the route of a file per component, be aware of some of the things that Jacob is mentioning, that these are now separate libraries with their own separate ability to, like, it comes with a lot of cool benefits, right? Like you can track analytics independently per component, which is pretty neat. But do you really need that? Because you can also do breakdowns for anyone who has design system analytics, right? That's a way to check that kind of stuff out. The other kind of one that is often hard to tell is that, let's say all of your component files all reference the same foundations library. And if you make a change to that foundations library and publish that change, every single downstream component library also needs to be republished. And that may not necessarily be obvious all of the time. So, and that's a nice checks and balance, but only if you're ready for that level of maintenance and that level of overhead, right? This is why I say always optimize for, like, what is the goal here at the end of the day, right? It's to get people using your system, getting adoption, getting saving time, driving consistency, right? And so at what point are you making the trade-offs between, wow, this is a lot of upkeep just to manage that, versus, cool, we've got one file, we've got two files, we've got three, we separated out foundations, we separated out components. That might be more than enough. And that's probably the way that I see it more frequently happening for a lot of teams.
I just have one quick thing to add is Louis, who's another DA on our team, actually made this really great community file where he outlines for different kinds of plans, if you're pro org enterprise, how you could approach organizing your design system. And he does kind of break down into if you have like every single component in its own separate file versus all of them together, what are the pros and cons of those? And I guess just reiterating what people said, like there are benefits to breaking it out. There's just more being able to track what specific changes are being made to particular components, but it's also going to definitely cause a lot more overhead work in managing and maintaining all these libraries, who has access to them, what are like the default libraries that are set up for every single different team. It's definitely a lot more, but it does give you more granular information on it. But I'm just going to quickly paste in the link to Louis' community file because I think it's super helpful and just kind of dives more into it.
Awesome. Next up, we have Ricky asking a question here around, are we working on a native accessibility / contrast checker? I personally am not. I'm not sure if anyone is working on it inside of the company. That said, what I will recommend here for people that are like suggesting features or curious about this is we do have a forum where you can suggest ideas and kind of upvote them that's there. I'd highly recommend that just for a way, especially if there's a feature that you're really looking for, just as a ways to just suggest it. Personally speaking, as a product manager internally here at Figma, one of the ways that I prioritize projects is by looking at that forum that's there and seeing what the community response is to these things. So if there is that strong community response to something like a color contrast checker, that's something I'm going to really look at and heavily prioritize for my roadmap that's there. Chad, Anna, any idea if there's anything going on?
Nothing that I've heard of or been told, but that doesn't mean it's not something the teams are thinking of. So I know that as Ds, we relay a lot of this feedback to product teams as well. So
there was certainly a time, I think, when the product was small enough that it was able to stay on top of all of the amazing work that the different work streams are doing. There's a lot out there now. So yeah, if it's not something I'd be curious to figure out, we'll get back to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we are thinking about all the time as well. Obviously, when we did the light mode and dark mode work for Figma itself, we looked heavily into color contrast because it's just a necessary requirement whenever you're providing that new kind of theming that's there to make sure it's successful. Another thing to call out, though, right now is currently there's the WCAG 2.0 standard for contrast. There is the in-progress WCAG 3.0 standard as well, and that may be something that we would want to consider waiting for, just for that to kind of solidify a little bit. Because I think it's the APCA is the new advanced kind of color contrast checker that's out there, which does make a bunch of improvements, especially for saturated colors as well. Trust me, we were definitely thinking about these things for sure. It's at least not on my roadmap yet, but hopefully after I launch Design Tokens, which is the stream that I'm working on right now, it can be something we can dive into.
Awesome. Next question here from Todd. Jacob, I know you and I have talked about this quite a bit actually in some of the past building blocks episodes. And Anthony and I know we get this question a lot as DAs, right? The question is, I often see or hear that creating or building and driving variants from base components are not advised. The question, is that universal or conditional sentiment? Why would it not be optimal? And what's the alternative that accomplishes similar functionality? One thing I'll say up front is someone who used to use base components when I first started using Figma. One of the biggest pieces of feedback I got from teams was that the consumption experience wasn't great. They had to click into multiple nested layers in order to change things. It was easier for me as a maintainer because I could just go ahead and select one thing, change it, and cool. But as the feature set has grown in Figma, with creating component properties, being able to select all matching instances within a component set, very quickly found that all the overrides you end up putting onto instances built off a base component, those just become your main components in that set now. So you're kind of get into, as a maintainer, you're creating extra work for yourself as well as additional for your consumers, which I know that also kind of plugging Schema against Schema last year, Jan Thoman, he gave a great talk about, code aligned UI kits and, really driving that message of optimizing for your consumer. But I know there's a lot more on this as well. Jacob, I know obviously there's some of the performance side of it, and I know we run into some things with, overrides, resizing, love to get both of your takes on it.
Yeah, I definitely have to agree that most of the time when I'm seeing people using base components, it's partly with the anticipation that there's going to be some kind of massive change. But I think once you establish your design system and kind of like your standards and processes, it becomes less important and can become more of an annoyance for people, as Chad mentioned, with having to dive into nested layers in order to make specific changes. And then also it does definitely benefit design systems managers and maintainers a lot more than it does like the designers who are consuming the system and using that to build out their flows. And so it is a really big point where even if it makes it more difficult for the design systems managers, at the end of the day, like one of your biggest responsibilities is creating and developing a system that works for users, just like any other designer, right? It's always considering what is like the end user's perspective and their experience. With kind of the system that you're building out. And I do have like one question though, and it's just because I'm not sure of this myself, but when it comes to teams having multiple brands, and they all want them to have this level of consistency, I've seen people using base components to ensure that essentially every library that has its own separate brand or theme is still feeding off the same foundation. I'm curious to hear what your opinions are in using base components for that reason.
Yeah, I'll jump in there with it. Oh, Anthony, you take it.
You go, Jacob.
Take it,
You first. I'll go next.
All right. I mean, to Anthony's point that he said earlier, don't be clever unless there's like a strong need for this. And there's definitely going to be situations where you do need base components, and the management of these components is just too much as far as overhead that's there when you're trying to maintain the system, when you're trying to maintain that consistency that's there. If maintenance of the system is really just amount of effort that's there, then I would say, try and optimize for that, pursue as much as possible just to put in the effort to make these things without base components. But if what you're realizing is that, you have teams that are widely distributed across, multiple time zones, cities, products, brands, all those type of things that are out there, then it also introduces an aspect of consistency inside of your system as well. And there's chances that these teams that are adopting this core kind of base design system that you have may go out and make these changes, either too slow or, they're making them slightly wrong. And in that situation, I do think that there is a lot of value in that kind of base system that's there because it enforces consistency inside of that system as well. So really just evaluate what is that use case that you have. Does it demand a base component architecture? And there's definitely situations where things do demand that. And luckily, there is the ability to do the exposed nested instances now, which helps for those architectures a little bit. And if you do have the requirement, by all means do it. If you don't have that requirement, try and avoid it for sure. Anthony, I'm going to pass to you.
Yeah, I would agree. I probably have a pretty strong opinion on this one. So maybe hot take, maybe not, but I would say avoid it at all costs unless you have a specific use case and something that you think really makes sense and you've tested out. The reasons being are some of the things that we have talked about already, right? Like base component architecture wraps your components in new main components, which adjusts the architecture of those components long-term. There is a cool concept, and I think someone mentioned this in the chat too as well, of wouldn't it be neat if we could extend main components, right? Couldn't you have this idea where the component assumed the properties of the other components without necessarily needing to change the architecture by wrapping it in a new main component? This was, I think, more of a holdover from, this isn't even a Figma thing. You see this in Sketch, you see this in other tools as well, where you're just adjusting the architecture when you rewrap these components. And so the problems there is that makes the heuristics of understanding which two things are the same or similar, or how themes should be applied, or what instances should be swapped. It makes all of that much more complicated because now you may have a base component and you've got a series of themes with components that don't necessarily match the structure of that base component. And now you're chaining libraries too. Chaining libraries can also come with its own complexities. As I mentioned earlier, when you publish an upstream library, you now have to publish all of the downstream libraries. You can run into similar things by accessing these sort of base components from another library. So my recommendation there is keep libraries flat, keep things simpler in that sense, which for me is avoiding base components in that sense as well. I'm certainly sure that there's a lot of very specific use cases where they are valuable. And I do see that too as well, but the amount of headache of walking those decisions back can be a lot. And I do find that sometimes it's easier to just work with flatter components. If you are doing the multiple theme approach, using a plugin like Themer is great for it. If you just need to maintain multiple themes that all have the same base component, set the overrides and store those in some kind of sticker sheet file too as well. That's another great approach to this, right? You could have 5 variations of components that have been overridden with themes, which you can do with one click with something like Themer too as well. Obviously, this is all probably going to change with the launch of tokens, so this might be moot in a bit. But the thing that is key there is that sticker sheet approaches can be valuable for this, because now you can have any kind of changes that you want stored as overrides, which someone can then go copy and paste. If that library is published and they copy and paste those components, you're going to be able to have those instances show up already with those overrides applied.
Yeah, I think
Awesome.
that was a really good point. Also, just with your whole issue with having to make sure that you're constantly publishing the libraries. If they're feeding from one, you're updating it, you're updating all the other ones. And it actually makes me think of Chad, when you were stress testing swap libraries, that was an issue that you came across as things got more complex. The ability to swap things just became this whole checklist of, okay, I did this point and now all of these others that are trickling down related to it, having to publish those and make sure that they're applying to all of the files that are using the components and styles from those libraries.
Alrighty, we are now at about 15 minutes left in this live stream, which is awesome to go through all these questions, but I think we need to do some kind of speed rounds that's here. So what I'm going to propose as a format for all of us is I'm going to go ahead and answer one question. I'm going to popcorn it to who I think is best equipped to do the next question. And we'll each take 1 minute, 30 seconds to try and answer these things. Are you ready? All right. Anonymous attendee asked, will you make nested properties changeable across multiple selected instances of the same component? I can't change a nested prop across multiple instances of the same component like I can with non-nested variant props. This is in relation to component properties that's there. And absolutely, that's something that we're looking at doing. We released the early version of component properties last config, and then we released a new update to it, which is the V2 beta that's out there, and that's been out for about 2.5 months. We're always looking at ways to kind of improve the UX and consumption of this. We feel like we've created enough of kind of like the base architecture that's there, though there still are a few things that we're trying to kind of work on with this in order to make sure we have those proper foundations. For example, there's still a few property types that are missing, such as color properties, for instance. We want to make sure we have those foundations really robust first. After that, what we're going to do is kind of pivot to working on the UX improvements that are there, such as allowing you to change those nested properties across multiple components. So definitely we're going to be working on those UX improvements. All right, I'm going to popcorn it over to Chad. I think you can answer this one.
Yeah, great question. Creating a component library and not yet at the stage of being a design system. Do you still recommend using design tokens? Great question. I think I would recommend check out episode 2 of Building Blocks. Jacob and I actually go through a little of this in the considerations on how should we start to name things. If you're just building out and you don't really have an established system yet, short answer, I'd say, no, you don't necessarily need to be using tokens yet. If you are only building for a single brand, you may not need to introduce complexity. Maybe you're not building with modes yet. But yeah, I would definitely check out episode 2. And then also we talk a little bit about it in episode 3 of Building Blocks as well. So check out the Figma YouTube channel and the Building Blocks playlist. Both of those will kind of give some additional points in there for you to consider if you should or should not, if it makes sense for what your team is doing. Awesome. And for the next question here, I'm going to popcorn this one to Anthony because I do not know.
Can you read me the question? I'm not sure I have them all in front of me since I dropped.
Sure. Our next question from Chris here, it says, I love the new spell checker feature, but it doesn't spell check layer names. Is that something in the works?
Cool. Yeah. So a little bit away from design systems here, but maybe all of you saw we just did a big launch for spell checker, which was super cool. Does not currently work on layer names. There's a lot of reasoning behind that, partly because we often see layer names taking the form of things that are just not words. This could be everything from abbreviations or things like that. So for now, it's mainly going to be on layers. One cool thing, if you have a text layer and you adjust the text within that layer, the layer name will update if you have not already changed it. So if you do correct the text in the canvas, it will update the layer name to reflect that change as well for text layers. So hopefully that helps. And I'll pass it over to Jacob for next one here too.
Absolutely. So we have a question from Eduardo. Are there any plans to create a native JSON export-import option to work with developers easier without the need for external plugins? Absolutely. As we're working on this design tokens feature, especially, obviously JSON is the real interop format that's out there. Look at the W3C community spec that's out there for tokens at the moment, and that is the proposed kind of like standard format that we have for the future. We're definitely going to be trying to optimize to work with that standard as much as possible, whether that's import and export. All right, next up we have Drew asking, I'm beginning the conversation with my devs to bring more structure to our design tokens. What are some helpful workshops that we can run through to gain alignment on naming, abstraction, etc.? Anyone want to field this one?
I don't know of any specific workshops per se, but I would have to say from companies where I've seen this most successfully implemented is not so much like the design team necessarily leading everything and saying like, this is our process and this is exactly how we're going to name all of our tokens and organize everything. It's generally like a united front, and normally it's led by someone both from the design side and someone from the engineering team. And I've seen lots of companies as well where these are the two key people who are leading the tokenization efforts from their respective teams. They're the ones who are making sure that everything is aligning as much as possible between what's in design and code. And something that people have done is they'll hold like essentially like a regular weekly or bi-weekly office hours that's open to everyone else on their teams for them to kind of like answer questions and also deal with any kinds of problems that arise based on the existing system, so they can continue to adjust and improve things as they go. But other than that, I think also using component properties is really helpful, because that feature was specifically intended to help make components in Figma align more to how they're built. And so, yeah, that's the most practical thing, but otherwise it's mainly like process recommendations for that.
One small thing to add on there too, and the author of some of these things actually just dropped in a link to as well. You'll hear, so there's great work out there from Nathan Curtis as well. Audit your systems. What do you have? What are you working with today? That can be a great first step to understand where you need to go, and talk to your developers. Either they've already done this, or they've been near projects like this, or they have wrestled with these types of questions before, and they are incredibly helpful in these kinds of scenarios.
Awesome. So our next question here, best practices around organizing organism components versus page templates versus feature-specific components. Oh, the short answer here is it depends. I don't know if I can necessarily fit this answer into a minute and a half. Kind of high level for thought here. You know, around organism components, you know, I think we talked a little bit about, you know, do you put everything into one file? Do you kind of split things out? I'm personally a fan of splitting things out. It gives a little more flexibility on where you're publishing them. A question we do get is when you get into that page template layer, right? Like, how do you distribute that? I've talked with some folks who they actually just make a page, a component, and it's meant to be detached. So they may publish out a library of some pre-built page templates that you then bring in and you detach it. Another approach I actually just recently learned about is sometimes you might have pages already set up living within a project, and I'm seeing where folks are sharing out a link that has /duplicate on the end of it. So that way, when a designer needs to get started working with this page template, they can just click that link that already has duplicate at the end, and it creates a duplicate of that template file for them to begin working with. So I thought that was something pretty cool there. I will just ask, you know, kind of just Anthony, Anna, any additional thoughts here?
Yeah, one quick thought from my end is, think about permissions and who should have access to change what. Permissions within Figma as a system in particular is at the file level, project level, and team level, not at the page level. So that could influence, you know, maybe somebody shouldn't.
I think with the maybe you shouldn't. All right, well, we'll come back if Anthony comes back. We'll come back on there. For this next one here, Anna, popcorn this one over to you from Caroline.
Yeah, so the question is, I know it's possible to publish Figma, FigJam templates to the community, but what if we want the templates to stay within our organization? Is that possible? My team and I were thinking of publishing templates so that design team can easily start documenting their project-specific components. So yeah, if you're using it specifically for documentation, I've definitely seen people creating components, not just out of like the elements that you're using to build out your feature designs, but also just for documentation in general. So if you want to create any kind of like annotation tooltips, some cards that'll show where you're supposed to place like do's and don'ts for how to use different components. You can definitely create a whole separate library and components of those for your designers to use to help standardize your documentation, especially if you want those to live inside of your Figma design files. Otherwise, some other approaches you could do is kind of like what we're talking about, having overall page components. You could imagine doing the same thing for documentation. So it's easier for designers to kind of like bring in like different images and stuff, add descriptions. You could also even use Figma community. So just publish out as long as it's not anything sensitive that you don't want others to have access to, and then just let your designers duplicate those from Figma community and essentially treat that as templates. So yeah, those are just a couple of different approaches for that.
Next up, we got a fun question that's in here, which I'm really liking. This is from Barista. What was your first task at your position regarding design systems? I'm talking about your beginnings. So I'm a new designer. I would love to know more about your progress and feelings along the way. Yeah, let's go through each of our kind of journeys that's there. For me personally, I started, I think my very first kind of like systems-y thing that I did was I was 15 years old, and I was working on some like graphic UI kind of backgrounds for computers for AT&T. They were having some sort of like trade show or something. And that was my first exposure to like kind of looking up a actual proper like brand design guideline that was there. You know, they had like, here's the colors, here's the usage of the logos, here's the things that you want to do. After that, I transitioned actually into the dev world quite a bit more. And I didn't get back into design systems until probably, God, 4 years ago or so, where I was working on design tooling pretty heavily as I was a prototyper for a long time. And then as a person working on design tooling, that naturally transitioned into me kind of running a design tooling team, which was then a design systems team over at Atlassian. And then I came over here to really focus on building out more design tools for people. So that was my journey personally. And I'm going to pass it to you. What was your journey here?
It would have to be at my last company. So I kind of led our team's migration over to Figma, just because we were using a bunch of different tools and designers were having the issue where we're accidentally overwriting each other's work and our files were all kind of like living in a bunch of different places. So kind of I felt as a responsibility in helping lead our migration over to Figma. The big thing to start with migrating is always with your design system and making sure that you're building up as much as possible, implementing like processes so that other designers can get quickly started and using the new tool and comfortable with it. So that was kind of like my first foray. And I would have to say I've definitely learned a lot from it. And kind of just with some of the other questions I saw before, like a design system, even if it's a single library and you're on like a really small team where maybe even you're the only designer, there's one other person, I would still say that's a system. Like a design system to me isn't just your libraries and how many components and styles you have. It's also like the processes that you put in place, even if it's just intended for you or one other person, like defining how you're going to be using your different elements and components, how you're treating color. Those are all considered a system to me. And we've like had this conversation too with the DA team where part of design systems are also like the people as well, and how they work together and communicate. And I think that's a really important element to consider, like when you're going to design systems. It's not just, okay, practically, how are we organizing everything and where's all the components living, but also like, how are we talking to each other? And, you know, like, how do we handle different problems as they come up?
Cool. I think, does it count when I first started by building out my libraries of grungy textures and grunge brushes for Photoshop when I was creating lots and lots of musician flyers? Does that count? Yeah, I think that was kind of my first thing. But then where I really started diving in, as Jacob mentioned at the beginning of this building blocks, right? You know, so much with design systems started in, you know, graphic standards manuals of the past and, you know, those design standards. And one of my previous companies, another designer was like, hey, check out these old graphic standards manuals from the company from the, you know, 60s and 70s. And like, I thought they were so cool, and just like how everything was, you know, very descriptive of when this is used, why it's used, how it's perceived. You know, I really got into that, and I started bringing some of that to our web platform where I'm like, well, let's think about this thing right now. Like, we're just all over the place with things. You know, what if we were to consolidate some of our styles here? And what if we were to kind of we've got about 1,000 different buttons that are all slightly different. Like, do we need these? What if we brought these together? And so it started getting into, it was style guides, right? Like that was the big thing. Like, oh, I created some style guides and then kind of led into some documentation, which then kind of led into some of the influencing people side of things on why we should do this. And then starting to evolve things and starting to get other people interested. So that was kind of my beginning. And I just kind of did that at every company I've worked at since, up until my last company before Figma, where we actually had a full design system that had already been in use for almost a decade when I joined. So it was really cool to see it then, and just like all of this governance and all of the adoption that was there, and to be able to just dive in and be like, oh my gosh, this is cool. Like I can learn even more. So with that, I think we can take one more question here before we wrap up today. Jacob, this might be, this is actually kind of a good one for all of us, but Jacob, I'm really curious in your side, because you talk to a lot of designers and developers, and you've also been in this developer side as well. Would you mind grab our last question here?
Absolutely. So we have a question from Par, which is, would you agree that the single source of truth should start from dev and then keep dev and Figma in sync? I think this question is really going on, where should your source of truth live? And should it be in development? And should it be in design? Where should it be in that process that's there? This again goes into the whole concept of it depends, which we've said a number of times that are there. This journey of keeping dev and design in sync is a very difficult one for sure. And what I would say is that your source of truth is really going to depend on the company itself. And it's going to be different for each company that's there. That said, one thing that I would highly recommend as much as possible is align the spec that you have inside of your design with the spec that you have for your code. That's one of the reasons why we actually launched component properties, is to allow you to actually have attributes for your components that matched as closely as possible to what you had inside of code itself. So as you're thinking about the architecture of these components, try and keep them as in sync as possible. That way, when you're trying to do that journey between the two, it's at least a little bit easier of a journey between them. That way, regardless of whether or not your source of truth is in design or if your source of truth is in code, at least the migration between them is a little bit easier. We are just past 10 o'clock right now. Thank you so much for all joining for this last kind of Q&A in the year. As usual, if you're curious about anything Figma, please go to help.figma.com for any sort of help that you need. Friends.figma.com is a great kind of community resource that we have out there where you can reach out to everyone that's there and talk about design systems or anything else in relation to design. And of course, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, which is the forum.figma.com, which is where you can go and suggest ideas, especially to us people as product managers. It's super valuable as a way to hear from you, the community, so we can know what we should actually be prioritizing internally.
Awesome. And
just as a closing out, this session, of course, it was recorded. It'll be available shortly on Figma YouTube channel. You can always check out the future live streams we have in store at figma.com/events. And also, we love to hear your ideas, whether it's product ideas, whether it's ideas for more events that you'd like to see us host, topics you'd like to see us talk about. Definitely suggest those, share your ideas with us. You can send a message to community@figma.com. Just like on the forums, our teams really read all the suggestions and ideas there. You email us suggestions and ideas as well. We definitely love to hear from all of you in the community, and we listen to those as well. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. It's been awesome. So many great questions. Definitely check out the rest of the building blocks playlist if you haven't seen the others yet. And we will see you soon in the new year.